So it is my very great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Dr. Hans van Tilburg. Hans was originally slated to speak at our inaugural conference planned for last November. Unfortunately, that was canceled for reasons we all know too well. The Forum on Hawaii's Military and Warrior Past is thrilled to have someone so eminently qualified as our very first guest speaker in what we expect will be many equally fascinating presentations to come. I'm going to interrupt this introduction for just a second to check on participants because I think there's some knocking on the door. Okay, make sure everyone's got in that we can. Dr. van Tilburg was originally introduced to the ocean on board his father's sloop, the Brunhilde, at age 8, and was diving by age 11. He has a BA in geography, an MA in maritime history and nautical archaeology. He's also got a PhD in history from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where he ran the graduate program in maritime archaeology. Hans has served as a consultant for UNESCO's Cultural Heritage Program and a co-instructor for underwater cultural heritage courses from East Asia to the Caribbean. He is currently the Maritime Heritage Coordinator for NOAA's Office of Marine Sanctuaries in the Pacific region and a diving supervisor for NOAA's National Ocean Service in Hawaii. Hans is a member also of the Naval Order of the U.S. Hawaii Commandery. This evening is volunteered that we can interrupt his presentation at any time with questions, so feel free to raise your hand or shoot us a chat and we'll do our very best to get your questions in. Or if you prefer, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. With that, I turn the proceedings over to Dr. van Tilburg in Hawaii. Aloha, Hans.
Thank you, Neil. I'm glad to be here. I'll hit the share screen button and see if we can take it from there. I hope you can see the first slide. Is it up? I trust the first slide is up.
Do we look good?
Okay, great, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll talk about, what my job is with NOAA. I'm a maritime archaeologist, and not only the natural resources, but the cultural resources as well within federally protected waters are of interest for their historic and archaeological purposes and for heritage and for memory. So tonight we'll talk about, the military heritage under the waters around the Hawaiian Islands. I'll begin with an early story. It's a little bit famous. It's the USS Saginaw. And if you didn't know that there was a Civil War era vessel shipwreck, a Navy shipwreck in Hawaiian waters, well, there is. This is very early on, of course, in our engagement with the Kingdom of Hawaii, and a small side wheel steamer, a third-class, fourth-rate vessel, was built on the West Coast at Mare Island, in fact, the first vessel built there, to serve in the Pacific Station. And this meant, initially going over to China and protecting our interests in China during a very chaotic period. You can see in this slided gray the service areas for the decade that the USS Saginaw served her people and our nation in East Asia, and eventually up in Alaska, and even down in Mexico during the Civil War and the French intervention. But her final duty under her final commander, Montgomery Sicard, and here's an image of him, and you can recognize that young man, old look that we see in Civil War era photographs quite often, was to go to Midway Islands, which had been claimed as United States territory, and begin to open the channel to use Midway as a coaling station for the Navy. And this is an image of Midway Island back then, very bare of any trees, of course, only a couple contractors' huts. But unfortunately, after that effort failed actually to open the channel, they just weren't efficient at blasting a channel in coral reef with dynamite. They just made bigger piles of rubble. The Saginaw went to pick up the work team, the hard hat divers, and Sicard did something very responsible. On the way back to San Francisco, he was going to swing by Kure Atoll about 70 miles away to check for shipwreck survivors because there had been notable wrecks there. Unfortunately, it was a dark, cloudy night. They were running downwind very slowly. The boilers, the fires in the boiler had been banked, very little steam, and that meant that this small vessel was quite unmaneuverable, and she went into the breakers at about 2 or 3 a.m. and stranded 93 of her crew on this remote atoll island, at Ocean Island they called it back then. Kure Atoll we call it now, and you see a modern image. And this is where the famous story starts. They managed to survive on the island. It was quite a well-organized survival effort, and they modified the captain's gig, a 22-foot whaleboat, and decked it over with some open hatches on top, and made a new set of sails. And 5 volunteers set off for the main Hawaiian Islands to let them know that a rescue voyage was needed. One fellow was a sailor from Manila who had enlisted in the Navy. One fellow was William Halford, the coxswain here, and the leader of the mission was the young lieutenant, the executive officer, John Gunnell Talbot. And this was a 1,500-mile open ocean voyage with, repaired navigation equipment and spoiled provisions. And by the time they made it to the main Hawaiian Islands, they were so famished and incapacitated that they rolled in the surf on Kauai, and 4 of the 5 perished on Kauai. The 5th, William Halford, survived to tell the tale, and a steamship was sent by the king to rescue the remainder from Kure. Quite a remarkable story of rescue. And when we see the quote, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends," that was set on Talbot's memorial tablet. So knowing the story, we were very interested in finding the remains of the Saginaw. That's a pretty early vessel for out here in the Pacific Islands. And we knew that at Kure Atoll, here you see part of that atoll, that this is the area that the Saginaw was lost, on the east side of the atoll. Despite our abilities with magnetometer and side scan sonar, you can see from this bathymetric image the very rough topography of the spur and groove coral formations that surround the atoll itself. And this is an image of that kind of topography. So we could not really rely on a magnetometer or side scan sonar to find it. We had to dive along the coast, very close to the reef, in what are difficult diving conditions to search for the site. And in fact, we did find the site. The initial thing we came across was just a small handful of brass tacks, really, but there's no reason anything would exist up there accidentally. And pretty soon we found the forward sheet anchors and several of the smaller carronades that they carried broadside armaments and chain locker, etc., in close proximity to the reef crest. And moving further into the reef structure, that spur and groove topography, we then came across one of the steam cylinders, the trunnion steam cylinders, piston rods, engine room equipment, the brass and bronze fixtures from the engine room. You can see the diagram here from the construction drawings of the pieces we were looking at. And nearby in a cove, the larger elements of the paddle wheel shaft, boat anchor, other elements like that. It tells the story of how the vessel broke apart over time and was pushed around on the reef, with a lot of the lighter elements being blown into the lagoon over the reef crest. But here is really kind of the diagnostic signature of the Saginaw's wreck site. Besides the smaller carronades, she carried 2 of these rifled cannon, these pivoting guns, fore and aft. And this was, all the punch that the small side wheel steamer could mount at the time. But this is that, kind of remarkable Civil War technology that had made such advancements in armament. and those are very plain to see on the reef today. You can still visit the beach on Kauai where the gig was blown ashore, and that vessel is now with the Navy Museum. It had been in Saginaw, Michigan, at a museum there in Saginaw for a number of years, and it's gone back to the Washington Navy Yard. It's a remarkable artifact of the story. But here in Hawaii, you can go to the Nu'uanu Cemetery and see the resting place for Peter Francis, the sailor who enlisted in Manila, and then two of the contractor's hardhat divers that were also lost on the beach in Kauai, John Andrews and James Muir. The XO Talbot was, he was exhumed and returned to Kentucky to be buried in the family plot there. The story is written up in a book that I'll take a moment to be shamelessly self-promoting: The Civil War Gunboat in Pacific Waters, the service history of the Saginaw and the story of the wreck and discovery. And yet another book is being written as well about the event, and we're supporting that author's work with some research as we can. So it's really a wonderful story tied to the Hawaiian Islands, an early story of naval mishap in terms of shipwrecks. The next thing I want to mention is not so much a story, but the amount of resource underwater for military history in Hawaii, and this is naval aviation. We have some of the earliest naval aviation sites, as you can see, beginning in the late 20s and early 30s, these Keystone PK-1s, the open fuselage flying boats that were training to do the long-range patrols in the Pacific. These were not lost due to any accident. The images you see here were discovered south of Pearl Harbor. They're intentionally disposed as, obsolete equipment. But it's quite remarkable to find these things underwater. And we even stared at this insignia, trying to figure out what that was for the longest time. We were diving in the submersibles, the research submersibles here at about 1,500 feet depth. And it turns out it's the elephant holding the bomb for VP-1 insignia. This is pretty much like the PN-9 that Commander John Rogers made the first, almost the first single flight from San Francisco to Hawaii. He landed a little short and had to sail his flying boat the 100 miles the rest of the way. It's remarkable to see early things like this. But the bulk of the underwater resource is, of course, the World War II era naval aircraft. And more are discovered every day. And we assist divers who find them in the identification and remind them of the preservation laws that stipulate this is still government property and it's not to be damaged or removed or harmed, but we're free to appreciate these things underwater. Hellcats and Avengers and Dauntless and Corsairs, many in deeper water, but many in shallow water as well. They're relatively fragile sites. This Helldiver at SB2C is off of Maui and has only recently been discovered and has become a recreational dive site for our dive tourism industry. And so we work with the dive shops there to make sure they have the proper protocols and visitation for these sites. In this case, we do know this actual incident of this plane ditching in the waters. This was during, dive bombing maneuvers, combat training during the war. And Lieutenant Dill had a failure, a rudder structural failure, and was not able to make it back to the landing field and ditched the plane, and they both got out and survived. And we even found the tail nearby in the sand where we could read the bureau numbers on the tail, which tells us the individual story. Another common site for sport divers on Oahu is this Corsair. And this was a mishap that was due to an oil line failure from the aircraft being ferried from the Big Island back over to Oahu, I think in 1945. But a very interesting site for divers who like to see a little bit of history underwater when they come here to the islands. There are lots that we don't know the stories of. Avengers are relatively rare, but they get discovered. And if we can't make out the manufacturer's plates or the bureau number, we can't tell the tale of how this aircraft came to be here, but we do note its site and put it in the inventory. But there's one that is particularly of historical significance, and it's the PBY Catalina in Kaneohe Bay, because this was a casualty of the December 7th attack. The Japanese aircraft not only targeted Pearl Harbor, of course, as we know, but military installations all over the islands. And the Catalina flying boats, these PBYs, were the long-range reconnaissance craft that would have been able to follow the aircraft back to their carriers. So they were high priority targets. And there were some PBYs moored on the bay that morning. This one, as far as we can tell, was at its mooring, was strafed and blew up and sank to the bottom. And you can see the cockpit here. The fuselage is laying over on the starboard side. Here's the bow of the fuselage, the chine, and it's very murky waters. So it's hard to depict the site through photographs, but it's quite historic. And one interesting note about this site is that in the inside of the cockpit, you see the throttle controls on the overhead. We're looking forward out the windshield of the cockpit. And we've been told these controls are in the position that show that the port engine was being started up. When the attack happened, we don't have many details about the individual PBYs on the water because the bay became inundated with smoke from the base. But we know that pilots tried to make it out to their planes and get them off the water. And that may have been what was happening when this plane was struck. That makes it quite historic. We can't see a lot of the site due to the murkiness of the bay, but the University of Hawaii undergraduate science divers we use drew the site by hand and by measurement. And here's a sketch of that site, which really isn't possible to be seen, although it's only 30 feet deep in Kaneohe Bay. The fuselage on its starboard side, the starboard wing and engine nacelle and the float, and then a section of the tail. We know that there were 3, 4, maybe 5 more PBYs on the bay that morning, but we don't know what happened to them, and we haven't located them yet. But about the aviation resource in general, it's really remarkable when you look at the records, the crash cards for aircraft in Hawaii. We have over 1,475 records of naval aircraft lost in Hawaiian waters and Army aircraft. But this only goes up to about 1955. And beyond that, to do research like this, it becomes a little more sensitive and families are involved. So we're interested in this historic picture. But now that we have, the database, we can look at a really remarkable graph. Here is aircraft losses per year, 1922 to 1952. There are always going to be 1 or 2 or 3 lost every year. It's a hazardous occupation, but here are the war years, 1941 to 1945. And you can pretty much pick out the spike. In 1945, there were 545 naval aircraft ditched in Hawaiian waters. That is an average of 1 or 2 every day for the entire year. And that's quite remarkable in terms of the dedication and commitment and hazards of developing naval aviation in Hawaii. I would be remiss if I didn't say something about the USS Arizona, of course. And, we're pretty familiar with the story of the Arizona and Pearl Harbor. So there's no need to go over that again, but it's a rather remarkable site. The Park Service dive team in the 80s developed a lot of the techniques that we use as underwater archaeologists on the USS Arizona. And so these drawings come from the development of those techniques. And you can see, following the salvage of the superstructure topsides and the guns and lots of the ordnance also, what remains as a memorial and war grave in Pearl Harbor and an archaeological site. The Arizona has become kind of the test case for our understanding of how large World War II era steel warships deteriorate over time, which is a matter of some concern for a number of different communities and people, because she was topped off with bunker C fuel oil before the attack. And we estimate that about half of that oil, maybe less, is still inside those bunkers, and it is coming out. And so it's kind of a matter of, when, not if, something breaks inside this ship, and we want to know how fast it's deteriorating. And you can see a number of tasks that are part of the ongoing study of the USS Arizona. The electrochemical and microbiological corrosion, the oil analysis, and the modeling, the structural modeling of the vessel, all in an attempt to estimate this deterioration rate of a very complex steel ship in the marine environment. But in terms of heritage, what really counts, I think, is the fact that the Arizona is a memorial and a war grave and a major, major location for memory and commemoration. And as you know, the survivors of the crew have the option of being placed, having their ashes placed back inside the ship. And I had the honor of being part of a number of these interment ceremonies. There are certainly very fewer now these days. You can recall, there are 1,177 sailors who lost their lives on board the Arizona. 334 Arizona crewmen survived the attack, were not on the ship that day, or managed to get off the ship. And of the survivors, 44 have had their ashes placed back in the vessel in turret barbette number 4. So you can see here the image of the divers, the dive team, receiving the ashes after the memorial service and then taking them into the barbette. We dropped down to about 45 feet. It's zero visibility, but there is a crack in the bottom and a tool we use to push the box into the senior officer's wardroom, and we can feel it fall into the ship, and that's quite remarkable. It's quite an honor to be part of that, actually, when you think all these men had lives elsewhere and decided to come back and join their shipmates here in Pearl Harbor. That's really quite a remarkable statement. We've assisted with the same types of internment services on the USS Utah on the other side of Ford Island. Utah was, of course, a remote target training vessel and not a battleship at the time, but there were sailors who lost their lives on the vessel when it rolled over during the attack. So there's a plaque in commemoration at Ford Island at the pier there. And we've done a number of interment services, assisted with them there as well. I want to switch to another topic now because it's simply such a large part of the resource underwater here, and it's amphibious operations and amphibious vehicles and landing craft in Hawaii. Here you can see from the inventory the numbers we have of very early versions of amphibious assault vehicles, Amtraks, LVT-2s, LVT-4s, armored LVT-4s, and landing craft, LCMs, LCTs, all kinds of different versions, and even large LSTs that were damaged in the Westlock explosion. This picture is rather remarkable because it is the Maui coastline in about May of 1944. These were training operations for Operation Forager, the amphibious assault on Saipan. And so lots of those training operations happened on beaches throughout the Hawaiian Islands. These types of sites offer opportunities for us to train young science divers at the University of Hawaii in research and archaeological survey techniques. And so here you can see some of those divers deploying a baseline for conducting accurate measurements on an Amtrak site. Here's the turret and the 75 millimeter howitzer, the open turret and the tracks of what is a very deteriorated LVT-4 site. Now, they practice photogrammetry as well, but we sometimes still make them do the old school, draw the site plan by hand, because photo documentation, photogrammetry works well when you have visibility. but archaeologists train for low and no visibility as well. And the techniques we use by hand to draw maps like this, which then provide an interpretation tool, work in good visibility or poor. But this provides something really nice when we talk to school groups or the public about, what the site means and interpret the archaeological past. There are others. There are, dozens of these LVTs around the islands, really. This is what it looked like. This was, of course, the product, this armored LVT Armored 4 assault vehicle, the product of an intensive and emergency, innovation efforts during the war, because we knew that landing forces on hostile shores is probably going to be the most dangerous thing that our Navy had to do. Normandy gets a lot of attention, and rightfully so. There were 76 amphibious landings conducted in the Pacific Theater during World War II, and some of the most difficult landings were conducted in the Pacific Theater and Solomons and places like that. If you look at the records in the archives in Washington, D.C. or in College Park, Maryland, you can find some of the documents associated with these training exercises. This is the Maui coastline here, and you can see the transport assembly areas for the 2nd Division, 4th Marine Division, and then the LST deployment areas. They'd open the bow doors, and these Amtraks would roll out into these lanes, red lanes, green lanes, yellow lanes, to simulated exercises on shore, and defensive structures were built on shore in the Hawaiian Islands during the war years to simulate areas that they would see in Tarawa and Saipan, etc. And so these were immense, complicated, complex joint force training operations, the likes of which we probably haven't seen on that level since these war days in the Hawaiian Islands, but necessary with such a hazardous operation. So I want to move on now to kind of a little bit of an ironic topic, a resource, because we use research submersibles to study sunken submersibles sometimes, but Hawaii does have a legacy of submarines lost among the islands. You can see the classes and breakdown from the inventory: Gato class, Palau class, Tang class, S class, the older boats, the pre-World War II boats that existed at the time of the outbreak. And then the Japanese submarines we have here, the ones that were captured immediately during or just after the war and brought over for study. And of course, the 2-man Japanese submarine that was involved in the attack on Pearl Harbor. And you might say, Hans, what is a German World War I era underwater boat doing being listed as a shipwreck in Hawaii? It was a relic. It was undertow in the Pacific and may have drifted in here, but that is somewhat of an oddity. The 2-man submarine, the mini sub, 5 of which were involved in the attack on Pearl Harbor, which arrived the night before in the back of larger I-class submarines, was quite an important discovery and find by the University of Hawaii Undersea Research Lab, HURL, which is one of the best seagoing acronyms I've ever heard, if you've ever suffered from seasickness. In 2002, HURL finally discovered this 2-man submarine resting in the deep ocean outside the entrance to Pearl Harbor. And as it is very historic, one of the few actual remnants of evidence of the attack itself, it is a study site for us. We've applied a number of environmental techniques to estimate its corrosion and deterioration over time on the seafloor. Here you can see the 4-inch shell hole that pierced the sail and glanced off the periscope inside the command space. It did not detonate. The USS Ward was too close to its target to give the shell time to arm, but it shattered in there and punctured the sides and sunk this sub. And here we are in the HURL submersible conducting corrosion investigation of the mini sub. Quite a historic, remarkable site. Other submarines are here, like this S-class boat, the S-19, but many of these were, intentionally disposed, salvaged, scuttled, or sunk during training exercises. So they don't have the same kind of story. But this image just shows you one of the tools we use in deep water, our ROV, our remotely operated vehicle. We call this Deep Discoverer, or D2. And D2 is examining the bow and the torpedo tubes of the S-19 located off the south shore of Oahu. The S-28 is a target that we did want to locate for a number of years, and we're searching for the funding because the S-28 was not an intentional disposal or a scuttle. This S-class boat was lost during the war, during torpedo training exercises in conjunction with its Coast Guard escort. And the escort lost communication with the submarine south of Barber's Point and saw an oil slick come up, and the boat went down with all hands, tragically. And so this is quite a historic and heritage location that we wanted to discover. I'm happy to say it was found, not by us, but by a private entrepreneurial effort, Tim Taylor, and he is doing his Lost 52 project in coordination with the Bowfin Submarine Museum in Pearl Harbor. Unfortunately, which is sort of typical for private enterprises, they don't share their data. But if you go to the YouTube link or look up S-28 and Tim Taylor or Lost 52 project, you'll find his website. You'll see some remarkable video imagery of the S-28 on the bottom. So we're glad that it has been found. And if I mention submarines, I should mention, just another project that we were involved with at Midway, and this is the USS Macaw, the submarine salvage and rescue vessel, the ASR-11. During the war, a submarine went onto the reef at the entrance to Midway, and so the Macaw was sent from Pearl Harbor to bring that sub off the reef and clear the channel, which was pretty important to do. The submarine did get off the reef. Unfortunately, a storm put the Macaw onto the reef, and the salvage effort was unsuccessful, rescue effort. And in fact, in another storm, several of the crew had to jump into the ocean, and there was life lost. And later on, they had to charge to blow up the site in place to clear the channel. So it's a rather remarkable story of salvage and rescue at Midway. And we've also been involved in the project at Westlock. And this has been called, Hawaii's second Pearl Harbor, but there was significant loss of life. In preparation for the combat in Saipan, the LSTs and other amphibious vessels were loading ammunition, shifting ammunition in Westlock. Something went wrong, and fires broke out, and ultimately there were a number of large LSTs as well as LCTs and Amtraks lost, and hundreds of sailors and Army personnel from Schofield Barracks who were handling the ammunition lost their lives. Of course, it was a wartime disaster, so it was immediately hushed up. So it's not as well known as Pearl Harbor, but there are still remnants at Westlock that tell some of the story. And you can see the fires at Westlock during that on May 21st, 1944. Very murky waters, so I have no images to show you, but you can see some of our side scan survey we did with the help of Mudsu 1, the Diving and Salvage Unit 1 at Pearl Harbor. They used their side scan, and we could pick out other barges and camels on the bottom. It looked like a lot of the other LCTs had been salvaged, but LST 480, which you saw the image of sticking up above the water, is still there. And here's the stern of LST 480 on the bottom at Westlock. And finally, the one we haven't found yet. This is also an historic vessel, but not located. The U.S. Army Military Transport General Royal T. Frank. It was in 1942 that the Royal T. Frank was bringing some of our Army Reserve recruits between islands, headed over to the Big Island. And so just north of Upolu Point somewhere, the vessel was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine and sank. And this is the incident that led to all of the inter-island landings and inter-island traffic being shut down, which changed quite a lot in Hawaii. But these were recruits of the 100th Battalion. And so this vessel has quite a lot of local meaning to us in Hawaii. And if we can, we'd like to be able to do the deep ocean survey and try to locate what's left of this military transport. So those are some of the case studies and examples of the resource that's out here in terms of Hawaii's underwater archaeology and military history and legacy. You can see the number that we have found in yellow and the numbers that are out there somewhere in white. And, you know, it exists as kind of an unseen undersea museum in the Pacific that talks about this type of dedication and military past. There is a report that's available online. It's called The Unseen Landscape, Inventory and Assessment of Submerged Cultural Resources in Hawaii. It talks about all of the shipwrecks in the islands, but the Navy shipwrecks, the military shipwrecks are certainly a large part of that, and the aircraft as well. And here you can see the breakdown of underwater sites by island, the ones we know about. So, you know, certainly I would be happy to share the URL for this report with Neil and with the forum, but also if you look for Unseen Landscape, Inventory, Submerged Hawaii, it'll pop right up. This is what a map of the wreck sites in Hawaii look like, military sites and others. The red triangles are mostly naval aircraft. And in fact, I'm not even putting on 1,000 red triangles because a lot of the crash cards, the military crash cards, simply say aircraft lost, Pacific Ocean, vicinity Hawaii. So that's not even enough for us to make a rough guess of where they could be. But in this GIS product, the red triangles are location very poor. Orange is, you know, we might be able to find it if we had the right equipment and funding. Yellow is we could probably locate it. We've got pretty good historical references. And green is located, confirmed, eyes on, hands on, underwater shipwreck. But I want to say in conclusion with the slides you'll see now, it's not just about the properties underwater, because what makes them significant is, pardon me, the history, the legacy, and you know what we all went through as warriors, as civilians, as in combat and on the home front during this period that changed everything for the Pacific and the world. And so for us as archaeologists and historians, we do very much remember who we're talking about when we're talking about shipwrecks. Here are the last patrol, pardon me, of the S-28, lost in deep water, thousands of water deep off of Barbers Point. And when we find images like this is how we, you know, teach the history to our young science students as they're learning the archaeology techniques. Here are the landing exercises at McKenna Beach on Maui. And then those groups of soldiers moving inshore, a communications battalion, you know, training for what they're going to meet in combat in very short time in the Pacific. And just the conditions of the islands back then, the territory of Hawaii, the small sleepy territory that became such a training location, an intensive training location for the armed forces, and what that meant for life, you know, on duty, off duty, what it was like. It's quite different now. So many people might have forgotten. But many people do remember. I think that's why, you know, tourism in Hawaii really picks up after the war, because servicemen remember the good times they had as well as the intensive training here in the islands. And not just the military legacy, but the home front as well. This reminds me of, you know, the sacrifices that were made and the dedication and determination of the residents of the territory during the war years. This is when my mother was here, and she remembers that, and all my aunties, and what it was like to live under, the suspension of habeas corpus and military governor at the time, and to make sacrifices and to take care of the sailors and soldiers who were here. The home front, just as important for us. There are a few places in the islands that you can see some of these images. The U.S. Army Museum in Waikiki is one place that is a wonderful archive, and the museum itself is free and captures some of this legacy and heritage specific to the islands. It's really remarkable that, given how many photographs we have of other places, there are not a lot of pictures from the World War II period that we have as, public. And I'd asked my aunties and uncles, why is that? And they said, Hans, you can't be out with a camera taking pictures of Pearl Harbor during World War II. So pictures during that time from the islands are pretty rare. But you can see in some of these military photos from the Department of Defense and National Archives, the reception and the care and the connection that the 4th Marine Division, 2nd Marine Division, and others, received here in Hawaii, were adopted by people in the Big Island and by Maui during the months that they lived here, and came and went to the dangerous combat in the Pacific. And so I really like to show these to the public to remind them of, what it was like in the islands and what that meant for these islands, which could have been the targets, for some of the action that was seen elsewhere during the war, and what it meant for the locals to see these young men come and go on these ships. We all know the story, or should, of the 100th Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the Nisei volunteers of Japanese Americans, many of whom's parents were interned in camps while they went in droves to volunteer to serve in the armed forces. It is a remarkable story and really a topic for a separate presentation to do it justice. But I just wanted to include this slide as well to honor that story and say it's, perhaps for another time in the future. It's a remarkable story of dedication and patriotism. And finally, after the war, the departure of the Marine Division from Kahului, Maui. Just kind of remarkable images that capture some of that activity and farewell. So that is why when I used to get a chance to travel more before our current situation, and if I did get a chance to go to our NOAA headquarters back in DC and check in with headquarters folks, I would escape every moment I could to the National Archives and do research on these subjects, and then also pay a visit to the World War II memorial, the new memorial in the Washington DC Mall, and visit, because it's a remarkable memorial and homage to the legacy in the Pacific, which is the same legacy we see in our wreck sites on the bottom of the ocean around the islands. So thanks, that concludes my PowerPoint presentation, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Well, that was fantastic, Hans. Thank you so much. One of the things that really the couple of things that really strike me is, first of all, the astonishing amount of inventory that's out there. It's mind-numbing how much inventory there is. I don't know how one copes with all that. Yeah. And the second thing is the stories that go along with that inventory. It's really quite moving and fascinating at the same time.
Yeah, I think that obviously Hawaii is a strategic position in the Pacific, and was, the center for the training operations and exercises. So we don't have a lot of combat losses, just a few things left from December 7th, and some of the things left up at Midway Atoll. from 1942, but the rest is just, the hazardous nature of training before getting into combat. A lot of those aircraft ditches, they were trained to survive those and climb out, but a lot of accidents happened where, they didn't. So it's important to remember that. It's important for us archaeologists to remember that human element and the legacy of what we're looking at.
Well, I suspect that our participants have questions for you. So I'm going to attempt something here. I'm going to turn on all their microphones and we'll see what happens.
I'll be glad to attempt to answer questions.
Let's see if we can make this work. Well, that's supposed to turn them on. Let's see. Well, what I've done is I think I've allowed them to unmute themselves. So if they have questions, I think they can turn on their microphones in the bottom left of their screen and shout a question to you.
It's important to ask questions before the mandatory evaluation and test.
Is that working for people? Can you? Yeah,
Right.
it is. Go for it.
Wait, hey, Dr. Tilburg and Neil, thanks for pretty much having this the forum this thing. But I have no specific question, but it actually goes back. In Hawaiian history, we talk about Barbara's Point, and when Captain Barbara got his shipwrecked out here on Kalaiwa side.
Right.
You guys have any indication of where that was or how that occurred?
Boy, I wish we did. That's an early wreck. It's a wooden-hulled vessel, and for a lot of cases like that, it's going to be hard to discern any kind of trace. Rightfully so. When shipwrecks happen, often there'd be salvage that could happen afterwards. But and the environment has changed over time too. We have a relatively high energy environment. So I'm sorry to say we don't have any clue of that location yet for that one.
Any more questions? I'll give people still a little more chance to pipe in there. I have one question is, if people want to learn more about the maritime heritage, where should they go? Where do they go for resources or to learn more about the sort of things that you've touched upon this evening?
Well, there is information online. We're trying to revamp our website at NOAA so we can better share the information. Unfortunately, we have one website master at our headquarters office, so that's the bottleneck for our Sanctuaries program. All the reports that we've done for Hawaii exist on catalogs in libraries like Hamilton Library at University of Hawaii. There are reports online like the Unseen Landscape Inventory Report is available as a downloadable PDF online. And there are a couple others like that. There's some work we've done in American Samoa and at Swains Island. Those reports are electronic PDFs online. And once we finally get our website revised, we will have those PDFs on our website and more easy to locate. So there are references out there. It just takes a little bit of looking to find them.
Hans, this is Ray Scoff. Can you hear me?
Yes, Ray.
Hey, are you familiar at all with the remains to the superstructure of the Arizona located in Middle Lock?
Yes, I've seen them from a distance on the shoreline near Middle Lock. And I know that the Park Service and Daniel Martinez, who is the historian for the Park Service there, has, some access and experience with what's happening with that superstructure out there.
Okay, well, thank you. For many years it was just sitting out there rotting, and the Navy was always aware of it, but nobody ever did anything about it. And I'm hopeful that, you can actually identify. I was out there, and the portion that's remaining is it's a portion of the superstructure just forward of the #3 turret. It was a potato peeling room, a chemical storage room, and a hammock, I think, a drying room. And that was the portion of the superstructure that remained after it was used as a staging point for divers. And,
Oh, wow.
and if you see the very early pictures of the divers, you'll see that platform. That's the area. And then what they did, right, is they put a flagpole up and it became like an impromptu memorial.
Right.
And then when the current memorial was made, they had to cut it away. So it was part of the contract to take that superstructure and cut it away and move it to Middle Lock. And as you know, it's where an old abandoned submarine net base used to be.
Right. Right.
Again, I'm hopeful that they actually do something with it, because you can actually identify the rooms, and it'd make a wonderful memorial. You know, people could walk through with that portion of the superstructure, right? So
That's rather remarkable. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It reminds me of, the importance and the incredible story of the salvage that took place for months and months afterwards, and the divers that had to be brought in from San Diego and elsewhere. And it reminds me, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of blanking on the author's name, but he was a diver doing part of that salvage in Pearl Harbor, and he wrote a book, and it's called Descent into Darkness. And there are some amazing stories that divers tell, and really what he experienced and saw during those efforts is quite unique.
well, thank you.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Dr. Van Tilburg, it's Tim Soderholm.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you have an estimate of the sites around the islands that would be safely accessible by an average recreational diver, 100 feet or so or shallower.
Yes, I do. So the status of our inventory is, we're a public agency, and so we have a responsibility to share what we can with the public, as long as it doesn't endanger the resource. Now, there will always be some sites underwater that have, small portable artifacts or have the type of archaeological information that we don't want to make those open to the public and post specific positions. But we have an inventory and GIS product now, and so we're in the process of working with Navy History and Heritage Command, because we are by our memorandum of agreement with the Navy, we are the proxy managers for that Navy property in our sanctuaries. And so if we agree and they agree that these sites that are Navy property are non-sensitive sites, there isn't an issue of unexploded ordnance, human remains, and they're not vulnerable to, there's really nothing on them that can be looted. And frankly, a lot of these military sites underwater in diveable depths were discovered by the public initially and, revealed to us. We want to be able to share those sites with the public. So we're in that process now to make sure that we're not going to upset anyone when we start doing that. And then we can release positions, and particularly for nearshore, shallow water accessible sites that have some history to them. It would be interesting for divers to see. We do have some sites that already are kind of cleared for release like that. So, right now, if people contact me, I can share some of that information. I just don't have, the entire, portion of the database that's been cleared that we can put up as a map.
All right, thanks, sir. A fascinating presentation, and I appreciate you sharing it with us.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. I think we're going to have to call it an evening. General Kalivi, would you like to say a few last words?
Yes. So I just want to thank you again, Neil, for setting this up, and Dr. Van Tilburg. I mean, this was a great inaugural presentation, like you could say, for the forum, and I hope more comes like this. But your efforts have started off in a great movement, and I think we got a good start here that is going to have the beginning of more of this to come. And I thank everybody else who participated. I know we had more registrants on, but I just thank those who were able to make it in time for this. And I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did, because this was a tremendous history lesson for me. I didn't realize all the artifacts out there across the Hawaii chain in the ocean. So this is great. Thanks again. And I'll sign off, and I'll let Neil, you can close out.
Okay. Thanks once again to all our participants, and special thanks to our presenter this evening, Dr. Van Tilburg. It was really, really fantastic. You've set the standard for the rest of our presentations. And for those of you who are still listening, just a request, please visit our website, hawaiimilhis.net. Think about joining. We need guest presenters, we need volunteers, we need sponsors. And we're going to have a lot more programs just like this one in the future, I can assure you. The enthusiasm's there, the interest is there. So with that, I'm going to play our closing intro video, and I'll hang around for a little bit. If anyone would like to talk about the forum or has questions, I'll be around after the video.
Thank you, Neil. It's been my pleasure.
It's been our pleasure, absolutely. Thank you so much for doing this.